Greetings everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything. It's Friggity Friday. Hopefully you guys have an awesome weekend lined up. Right in the heart of summer here. Well, we got about a month left until the leaves start turning colors and the temperatures cool a little bit. Hopefully with the cooler temperatures comes a hotter video game industry, because right now it's pretty slow, but that has not stopped you guys from asking awesome questions. As always, we do give precedent to those of you who are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD. However, we do take questions from everybody, and we will answer questions from everybody, but we do side with the people who are pledging at that Ask Shane tier. I think you guys can understand that. We do have a great lineup of questions this week. Let's get straight to them. Okay, question number one comes from Cinetike. Xbox recently has been pushing cloud gaming with the message of you don't need an Xbox to play Xbox. Pactor also believes this is the future, but have you experienced streaming games at all? How is the quality of the experience? Do you know of any friends, family members, or acquaintances that have tried it? How is the experience in different places and with different internet connections? I have tried game streaming since the very first game streaming service. In fact, a long time ago, I was at the very first press conference for a service called Gaikai. It was kind of like the first ever game streaming service, and all the press were there. And this was like the OG days, like 15 years ago. They all brought us in there. I think we played, if I remember correctly, it was a Batman game that they showed for the first time, and they let us play it. It was one of the Arkham games. And I remember I was pretty impressed with it, but back then, there was a lot of like weird subterfuge going on in the industry where you didn't know if you were really being shown stuff the way it would work in the real world. And that was kind of the case with the Gaikai press conference. It played pretty smoothly, and I was surprised by it, but it was also on like a LAN, a local network, and it wasn't really an apples to apples comparison of how it would work in the real world. Now, eventually, PlayStation, Sony ended up buying Gaikai, and so that ended up turning into PlayStation Now, which was PlayStation's game streaming service. Honestly, PlayStation was kind of ahead of the curve on the game streaming thing way before Microsoft was. It saw the idea, the concepts behind game streaming, and invested a ton of money to buy Gaikai. So I have been knowledgeable about game streaming for quite a while. I wouldn't say I've ever been a fan of it, though. So you ask me if I've ever tried it. Of course I've tried it. I mean, it's right there on Game Pass. I'm surprised that maybe none of you guys have tried it. I would assume you would eventually just be curious and be like, you know what, let me try to stream a game. So the first thing I will say is that obviously the technology has improved vastly from when it was first shown by Gaikai. And a lot of that is just because broadband has become much more prevalent pretty much everywhere in the world. Now I'll say this, the internet in America is not as good as it should be. And with the big infrastructure bill that Biden's administration signed, there was literally billions and billions of dollars in that bill to provide broadband internet service to rural communities in America. And it has worked. Tons of new people have broadband now in America that did not have it just 3 years ago. So it's working, but obviously there's still a ton of work left to be done on it. And so I think, and you kind of get to this later in your question about, you know, how much do internet connections impact everything? It's a huge deal. Now, here's the thing. You don't necessarily need fiber or like the best cable connection like I have here to make game streaming work. It technically doesn't need that wide of a pipe, but what you do need is a consistent signal, one that won't sort of drop packets, and it's just a consistent signal, even if it's not the strongest signal. That's the thing. And again, that's something that broadband provides generally. If you're working on DSL or even cable, like for example, I'm on cable, and sometimes like late Friday night, late Saturday night, when everybody's back at the apartment complex and they're all streaming video and stuff like that, the connection's not as good as it usually is, and you will get a little bit of packet loss. So that's the more important part about streaming games. Now, is the experience good? I wouldn't say it's good. It's better than it used to be, but I would just say it's passable. I could probably play most single-player games game streaming. Now, I would never play multiplayer shooters or head-to-head fighting games on a streaming service. I don't know if we'll ever get to a place where that is actually feasible. As we say a lot on Game Face, there's no increasing the speed of light, and the speed of light is pretty much the fastest thing that we have. So right now, things are going at the speed of light, and it's still not good enough for multiplayer shooters and head-to-head fighting games. I don't know if that problem will ever be solved for game streaming, but let's be honest, playing head-to-head fighting games online, what are there, 5 or 6 million people in America doing that, roughly? I mean, Street Fighter 6 has sold around that, maybe a little more. Even if it's 10 million, that's not all that much. Now, head-to-head shooters, a much bigger deal. At the same time, though, it feels like shooters are all becoming free-to-play now. Obviously, Call of Duty, and there's a couple standouts. Halo will probably never be free-to-play. But most shooters are becoming free-to-play these days. And so, is it that big of a deal? I don't know. I think Activision has a better idea of how many people are buying and playing Call of Duty solely for the multiplayer, and I would argue it's probably the vast majority of the 20 to 25 million people who buy it every year. So that's a big audience, and then when you combine it with the fighting audience, then it becomes something significant. So I do think there are huge barriers to both of those genres, but as far as playing like an action RPG, now, what about Dark Souls, where it's literally like every frame matters? That might bug some people. It would be interesting to see a really good Dark Souls or Elden Ring player play those games on game streaming to see if the best players can make it work. I think that would be a great litmus test. But my guess is they're not going to like it. And they're going to say this isn't the same. And it is never going to be the same. That's the thing. That's what people have to get over. It's never going to be the same. It's never going to be the same as having that client installed locally on your hardware. And Pactor's talked about how the Amazon Fire Stick eventually could have a 1 terabyte drive in it and a GPU and a CPU, but then it's just a console. So maybe that happens one day, but I think generally people are just going to have to accept that kind of what we're getting right now is as good as it's going to get. But I think what people don't know is how willing non-hardcore console players are willing to put up with what we have now. And that's the X factor. And until Game Pass and PlayStation Now start sort of focusing on the streaming-only options, I don't think we'll ever know that. And I think that's something that Microsoft should do. It should try to offer a really, really cheap Game Pass tier that is game streaming only. So we'll see if that happens, but I think until that happens, we won't really have a good idea. But to answer your question bluntly, I'm not a fan of game streaming. I'm always going to want to play things locally. I am a big multiplayer gamer. I am a big multiplayer shooter player. It's probably never going to satisfy me, but I also have set my expectations at a place where it's not going to disappoint me. As far as friends, family, and stuff like that who have tried it, I have a lot of nieces, nephews, and cousins who are big-time gamers, but they all buy consoles. Or the people who are more casual in my family, they play most of their games on mobile. So I think the other problem here is that right now it's a chicken and egg scenario. It's like you don't have enough people who are interested in game streaming to dedicate a bunch of resources to game streaming. And so I think we're kind of stuck with what we have now until Microsoft and some of the other guys start figuring out cheaper plans that are streaming only. Okay, next up we have a question from someone who asks questions almost every week, and I appreciate it very much, and that is Kevin. I saw you recently visited the new Los Angeles Clippers arena, Intuit Dome, and wondered what other arenas and stadiums you've been at and whether you have a favorite. Yes, I did one of my rare posts on Twitter these days. I posted a video or two and some images I took from an early access. It's funny they even called it that. An early access period at Intuit Dome. And I will just say, it is literally the world's most advanced arena. It is insane what they've done there. Now, we got to go, my wife and I, because we're friends with, I'm not going to say who, but we are friends with a big-time bigwig at the LA Clippers. And not only did we get invited, we got like front row, center court seats. Like we felt like VIPs going in there. And just to quickly give you an idea, if you didn't see my tweet on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, it is insane. Each seat there has its own climate control. So heating and cooling controls. Every seat has a noise meter so that if you yell, they record how loud you're yelling, and they can literally find the single loudest fan in the arena. So they have competitions. They're like, make noise! And whoever makes the most noise, they can find the one seat that made the most noise and give them an award. It's pretty amazing. They also, each seat has a video game controller in it, like a very simple like D-pad and buttons, and they play games with the whole arena, like trivia stuff or some active stuff. And literally, like, you play with other people in the arena on your team. It is so freaking cool. They also built the arena like a parabola, so there's no bad seat. Like, we went all the way to the top of the arena, and the leg room, I'm 6 foot even. The leg room and the very top seat, I had like almost a foot between my knees and the seat in front of me. It is an amazing arena. It's only for basketball, so no hockey, but they're also doing concerts there. And in fact, my wife and I were going to see a comedian, Sebastian Maniscalco, I think is how you say his name, here in a couple weeks there. And it's just opening, like it's the second thing that's happening there or whatever. So anyway, that arena is incredible. It is literally the nicest arena I've ever been to. There's also this crazy screen. It goes all the way around the inside, and like it syncs to all the stuff that's happening in the arena. It is incredible. Now you're asking me, like, what other arenas have I been to? I've been to a ton. Now, I'm not the guy who's like, I want to go to Wrigley to see what the field is like, or I want to go to Boston so I can see the Green Monster or whatever. That's not me. I just go to arenas to see teams that I want to see play, basically Pittsburgh teams. So I've been to a bunch of arenas to see the Penguins play. I've been to a bunch of stadiums to see the Steelers play. I've also been to a bunch of places just because. Like, I went to a football game between the Raiders and the 49ers at Candlestick Park before it was torn down. And that place, by the time I went there, was a dump. So was the Raiders Coliseum in Oakland. It was a dump. It is the worst stadium arena I've ever been in. Literally, there was sewage running through the walkways in that stadium. It was awful. I can totally see why the A's and the Raiders have left and went to Las Vegas, because they had a terrible stadium and they weren't able to build a new one. So I feel for you, Oakland fans, but let's be honest, like, they had to move. So anyway, those are some bad stadiums I've been at, but the Pirates Stadium, PNC Field, is probably the best the best baseball stadium in America. It's absolutely incredible how they build it. You're sitting there, you can see the whole skyline and all the bridges in Pittsburgh. It is absolutely amazing. So it's one of the nicest ones I've ever been to. But the nicest football stadium I've ever been to is right here in LA. They just built it. It's the Rams and the Chargers' new stadium, SoFi Stadium. It is mind-blowing how awesome that stadium is. And you can see some of the concepts, like the screens that they have at that stadium. The same company that did those screens also did the screens in the new Clippers arena, and incredible. Like, the way that the games are there, it's like all coordinated. It's like a show. Like, in between plays, there's no downtime. Music comes up and the graphics fly across the crazy screen all in time to the music. It's amazing, really. That is the nicest stadium I've ever been to. Now, there are some stadiums being built right now that may eclipse it. I've also been to the new Raiders Stadium in Las Vegas. It's very nice, but it can't touch SoFi. So to me, SoFi Stadium is the best football stadium in America. It's indoors, but also outdoors. It's like the sides are open so the breeze blows through, but you won't get rained on, and it never rains in LA anyway. So that's the best football stadium. No homer pick here. I really think the Pirates Stadium is the best baseball stadium in America. And then as far as like the best arena for like basketball or hockey, it's probably the new Clippers arena. It really is that amazing. Now, again, they can't host hockey games there, so that's a little bit of a detriment, but eventually there's going to be an arena just as nice as Intuit Dome that does host both sports. But for now, Intuit Dome is definitely the best arena. Okay, question number 3 comes from Commander Fett. Would you ever consider making a Patreon tier for people to ask questions to answer during Game Face? A lot of other podcasts do this, and it seems like a good way to connect with the community. Well, Commander Fett, I'm doing this to connect with the community. This is what our patrons requested. They wanted this show. They wanted me to answer questions from them every week. They wanted to ask Shane anything. And we've done it, and now we're at episode 112 or something like that, which is crazy. So, I mean, I feel like I connect with you guys really well with this show. Now, I do wish more of our patrons asked questions for this show, and maybe for Game Face as well. So maybe what we should be doing is putting out a call for Ask Shane questions on our Patreon as well as SIFTD.net. And again, that's something that's different for us versus a lot of other Patreons, is we have our own website. And the vast majority of our community interacts and does stuff at SIFTD.net and doesn't really do it on our Patreon. And so I do tend to cater things towards the website instead of our Patreon. But maybe you're right. Maybe I should be putting out calls for questions over on our Patreon as well, because there are some people who do just use our Patreon for our content. So maybe I should be doing that. As far as questions and making a tier for it, like, to me, that should just be included in the $4 tier that gets you Game Face day and date. I don't want to charge people extra money. And maybe you call me crazy or a dumb businessman or whatever. I don't think that would go over very well because I feel like people are already paying $4 a month for Game Face, and I feel like everything that's related to Game Face should go along with that. So I think really what you're getting at is, Shane, maybe you should ask for questions from Game Face from people who don't show up on the live stream, and that I definitely get. So we have an official Game Face thread in our forums right now where every Tuesday morning I go in and say, hey, show's happening again today at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. See you guys on the stream. If you guys want to ask questions for Game Face there that we will answer at the end of the show, just ask them in that thread. And I could jump on there with my phone even in the middle of Game Face and go answer them. But you're right. I should probably be asking for questions for Game Face on our Patreon as well. But then, of course, it's like we haven't really been answering questions that much on Game Face. What's kind of happened is Name That Game has kind of replaced Q&A. And a lot of times we're running over. And again, that's my fault as the host. I should get the show done on time at 3 hours every time. But we're not. And so we're at like 3:05, 3:10, and we just finished Name That Game because Name That Game is an X factor. I don't know how long it's going to last. Sometimes you guys guess it on the first image and it's over in 90 seconds. Sometimes it takes all 5 images or all 5 samples and it takes 20 minutes. So it's hard to plan the end of the show when Name That Game is involved. I do my best. But because of that, Q&A has kind of gone away on Game Face, and I do miss that, and I think it is important, and it is our flagship show, and we should be connecting with our patrons and our fans on that show. So I will take your suggestions to heart. Start putting your questions in that Game Face thread in our forums. I will start putting up a thread on our Patreon, asking for questions from our patrons there, and hopefully everyone's happy. Okay, our final question for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything comes from, and let me get this right, Beta Muse Max. I think that's right. Hi Shane, my first open world game was The Elder Scrolls Oblivion on Xbox 360. I think that may have been a lot of people's first open world game. During one play session, I was looking at the paper map that came with it, and that doesn't happen anymore, and thought, can I go into Black Marsh? I couldn't, but the idea that I possibly could was enough to get me to explore. It didn't lead to anything, but the thought of it was exciting. Have you had anything similar happen? Of course I have, and of course everybody has. That's why people love open world games. That's why open world games have taken over the industry, because it does, man. It ticks that like curiosity, like OCD thing that most people have. You just see something on the horizon. I mean, that was one of the things I first discovered in Ocarina of Time that changed games forever. It wasn't an open world, but it was so big that you could see things on the horizon, and you were like, man, can I get there? And you could. And then you get there and you're like, oh, wow, what's here? Like, open world games are great for that. And I think that's why people like them so much. And again, I think that's why they've taken over the industry. And again, I also think that a lot of people are like you, and Oblivion was kind of one of those first games that really did it. Now, it wasn't just open world games for me that did that. It was the advent of 3D games that did that. So the early PlayStation 1 games, the early Nintendo 64 games, where you're exploring 3D environments for the first time. And what happens is you realize, wow, they can tuck stuff away in these worlds in different ways than they were able to with 2D games. And so in the early 3D period of video games, I would scour every nook and cranny of the world to try to find secrets. Because the other thing, too, is like the internet was just starting up. And so there weren't conspiracy theories, but there are all these theories online. Like in Super Mario 64, you could play as Luigi if you went here and you found this and you did this thing and blah, blah, blah. And then people started finding like these breaks in the game where people could glitch through walls, and people started finding like hidden areas and things like that. And that just stoked the flames further. Now, what I would say is over time, like game developers, and as games got better and there were a few glitches that could glitch you through walls and other geometry in the game, I stopped kind of looking as much. I think you also start to figure out after a while, even with 3D environments, where they're going to hide stuff. Like if the more you play them, you're like, at this point, I feel like I have seen every potential hiding place in a 3D game to hide something. So over time, like I just feel like it kind of wears you down. Another thing too is that like developers got better. You couldn't find glitches in weird places in games anymore like you could in the early 3D days. And I think over time it just conditions you to like, it's probably not worth my time to start snooping around. Or you look at it like, well, if there is something cool, somebody else will find it and I'll hear about it on the internet and then I can go and check it out. Or now you can just watch a video of it on YouTube. So I feel like over time, games have gotten better. The worlds have become more cohesive and not as glitchy. And so I feel like my draw to kind of find that stuff has fallen by the wayside. But at the same time, the developers have gotten much better at doing what I mentioned when I first started answering this question, which is overtly teasing you to things on the horizon. A building that's way far away, a castle, or a weird weather pattern on the top of a hill. Or now developers have learned to play upon our curiosity and create worlds that we're really excited about exploring. So I love questions like this, by the way. Let me get your name right again. Betamuse I wish I got more questions like this that focused on the psychology of the player while playing games, because I do feel like that is something that someone like me, who has been in the industry, fully immersed in the industry for so long, it's insight that I feel like I can provide that maybe your 13-year-old YouTuber cannot. So I love questions like this. You came out of the box hard. Great job. Okay, that's it for Ask Shane Anything. You are officially released to go enjoy your weekend. Or maybe you're listening to the podcast version of this show while you're out doing fun stuff. I hope that's the case. We all pretty much have 1 month left to kind of get our summer vacations in. I'll be taking one here at the end of this month. I'll be gone for 5 or 6 days around Labor Day weekend to go home and see the family and my friends back there, and go to Philadelphia and see my crew there as well. So hopefully you guys have something planned, something fun to do here over the next month. But if not, we'll be here for you. We'll still be playing games. So thanks again to everybody who pledges at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD. If you're watching this show on YouTube, really think about like supporting us. Like obviously our audience isn't gigantic, but like we saw Game Informer went down today, which really hurts to hear. But we're still here. And if you want these communities to survive, you have to support them. Like, do we really want to get to a place where all we have left is YouTube and IGN? And no offense to IGN, it's great. They do great work, and I love a lot of people that work there, and they're an awesome website and all that stuff. But, like, we need options. And I have a little website over here called SIFTD.net that I made for you. It's just waiting. It's a community full of adults who love games just as much as you do. And, you know, if you want to support also, you know, we're independent. We have no conflicts of interest. We take no money from game developers and game publishers. None. So you never have to worry if we're on the take. Again, if you want to see this survive, you got to support it. So if you can, head to patreon.com/SIFTD. For just $4 a month, you get all our content way early. We really prioritize that. We want to make sure that our patrons are getting value for their money. So anyway, have yourself a great weekend. We'll see you for Game Face on Tuesday.